So welcome back. We're now going to talk about the influence of one of the major areas that IO psychology is focusing on as far as future trends and trends in IO psychology, and that is culture. So looking at culture is not just measuring and defining culture, which is definitely an area of IO psychology. We do want to measure organizational culture. And again, if we're looking at PE fit, part of that is measuring the person and measuring the environment. And the environment might be a specific job, the environment might be an organization, or the environment might be an entire culture or country that the organization or the job exists within. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we define culture and the reason that we're so interested in culture in the modern workplace. So as far as culture, generally speaking, what we're talking about is shared meaning and common assumptions that are similar by a group of people based on geographic or political orientation and connection. So it's worldviews, it's practical practices, it's interpersonal interactions, and it's goals. And generally, we do find that individuals within cultures will often differ greatly. So when we try to define someone simply by their culture, oh, you're English, you must behave this way, or oh, you're American, you must behave this way, we'll often find that that's not a great predictor. But broadly, culture does give us some information of how organizations are going to function within that culture, and also some broad information about how culture and organizations and cultures may differ from culture to culture. And one of the primary things that is driving this is diversity. Increasing diversity is a reality in organizations. So not only are organizations realizing that if their goal is to get the highest or largest pool of qualified recruits, they can't afford to not be looking at a diverse group of people that may or may not have the skills that they're interested in. Not only that, as we move towards our more global marketplace, companies, organizations, their customers are now also very diverse. And it's been found that generally speaking, diverse customers like to be basically working with companies that resemble their same diversity. So organizations that don't have an appearance of being diverse are at a disadvantage in a global marketplace. So there's increasing diversity in today's organizations, and in general, research has found that when diversity is managed well, and by managed well I mean there's an actual effort to integrate diverse people into functional work teams, that those organizations are also generally more productive and more innovative than organizations that are less diverse. So diversity is being driven by the changing workforce demographics. So basically, the workforce, the recruitment pool that companies are coming from, are becoming more diverse. More women are choosing to go into work, so there's gender diversity. More and more international within the United States, international candidates are applying to U.S. organizations, and also the actual demographics of the United States is becoming more diverse as we move forward into the 21st and on centuries. Legislation and lawsuits. So there is actually legal demands that organizations are fair in their hiring practices, and there is diversity expectations. Rapidly growing increase in international business. As I said, as organizations are dealing with multiple cultures, they also need to be culturally sensitive. So there's competitive pressures. There's research that shows that organizations that have diversity are more successful. And also the recognition and desire for a diverse viewpoint. Research has also found that the more diversity in groups and teams, generally the more creative and innovative that group and team becomes. So globalization is definitely a large factor in the modern workplace. 100,000 plus U.S. companies now have worldwide ventures. 20% of American jobs are tied directly to international trade. A third of large U.S. firms are now headed by non-U.S. Americans. So we're finding actually that U.S. companies are being bought up by foreign companies, and also U.S. companies sometimes are hiring foreign or non-U.S. citizens as their leaders based on trying to build up this globalization presence. Economic blocks have eased trade and multinational employment opportunities, so it's now also easier for people from any country to work in other countries, to get work visas, to actually, and also to become, take on leadership and management roles in these companies. So all of this, again, is driving this idea of a diverse workforce. So IO has a strong interest in multiculturalism, or examining how different diversity or different groups of people work in organizations. So one of the broad areas of interest is most IO theories and research has primarily been done, like a lot of psychology, on United States citizens, upper or middle to upper class, white, college-educated men. So there's a lot of research on determining, do these theories apply to different and more diverse populations and other cultures? Focusing on developing a workforce that is sensitive to the problems of color blindness. And what this really represents is what psychology has found that is, generally speaking, we are set up, our cognitive structure, the way we look at the world, people's cognitive structures are set to work through categorization and stereotypes. We create stereotypes about everything. You have stereotypes of what going to the restaurant is like. You have stereotypes about what certain movies are like. You have stereotypes about what dogs are like, what cats are like. And we also form these stereotypes about people. So if we're going to be talking about making organizations more diverse, if we're going to be talking about having people work with multiple cultures, we need to recognize that there needs to be an active intervention. There needs to be active attempts to manage this diversity, to train for this diversity, to recognize that people have a natural tendency to kind of default to stereotypes, which can lead to bias, which can lead to discrimination. And therefore, we need to develop a workforce that is not colorblind per se, but is almost aware that colors do matter to us, that we do categorize, and how to actually stop that process, to take control of it and to reduce it. So promoting the enrichment of diversity in workplaces, to manage diversity, to understand and cure expatriate stress and adjustment. So recognizing what cultures are going to be harder for people from other cultures to adapt to, and how can we help that adaptation process. And also, how can we learn from other cultures. So how do we recognize differences in cultures? So again, industrial organizational psychology is very much about measurement and categorization, and we have tried to come up with theories to categorize cultures. So we can define cultures based on language differences. We can define cultures based on understanding of time. So some cultures are very much known for being focused on being on time and time being very important. Germany is a good example. The joke often was that in Germany, no matter what government was there, the trains were always running on time. So that might be a very dictatorial control, but they're still a timely people. In contrast, in some cultures, time is not an important issue. And if someone says they will be there at 5 o'clock, they could easily show up an hour and a half later and not think a thing of it. So understanding of time is a difference that occurs from culture to culture. The norms of justice. So basically, what is equity? What is equality? What is need? And how is that viewed by that society? So some societies basically view need, who needs what, and what's the obligation of that culture to help those in need very differently. Is competition being encouraged, or is cooperation being encouraged? Is shame an important part of the culture? Is basically face, or how people are perceived by others, is that an important part of that culture, or is it not? Is the focus on how individuals get accomplishments done or how groups get accomplishments done? And also the importance of status. So all of these are traits that we could try to measure. We're going to talk about one particular theory of culture that is often used to kind of define the differences in culture in IO psychology. And that's Hofstede's theory of culture. Geert Hofstede is a Dutch researcher, and he distributed a survey to over 100,000 IBM employees worldwide. He primarily chose IBM because at the time it was one of the largest multinational companies that had offices in a lot of different countries. And he analyzed this data to develop a theory of structure of culture. In other words, he was trying to determine what is the organizational culture in these larger cultures, and how does it differ? So this is a work-related theory. And based on this large amount of data, he came up with 5 key dimensions. So, Hofstede's dimensions of culture. The first one he found was individualism versus collectivism. So the degree to which individuals are expected to look after themselves versus remaining integrated into groups. So a good example of this is individualists tend to basically talk about themselves. So if you ask an individualist to list the 5 things that define them, they'll probably define a lot of I statements. I am well educated. I am a psychologist. I am motivated. If you ask someone from a collectivistic culture to define themselves, they'll use a lot of belonging statements. I am a member of my family. I am a member of my country. I am a member of this organization. So that's two different ways of looking at the world. So US, Great Britain, and Australia are very individualistic countries. Most of Asia and South American countries and some African countries are very collectivistic countries. So if you're an individualist that goes to a collective culture, you're going to find some difficulty, even in organizations. So if you come from an individualistic organization, you're going to be used to basically self-promoting yourself, and you're going to be used to basically competing against everyone else to prove that you're of worth. If you suddenly move to a collectivistic organization, you're going to find some difficulty adapting, because your behavior, which was praised in the individualistic company, is now going to be seen as disruptive in the collectivistic company. Because the collectivistic culture is expecting you to work with a team, to never take personal accomplishments to yourself, but to try to help the group as a whole succeed. So this is just a quick look at individualism versus collectivism as measured by Hofstede across some various countries. So again, you can kind of see the US and the UK are very high in this. Russia, India, and Japan are fairly low in individualism. So the lower the bar, the more collectivistic the country is. The higher the bar, the more individualistic the country is. Another dimension of culture is power distance, the degree to which less powerful members of an organization accept and expect an unequal distribution of power. So basically, it's an acceptance of authoritarianism. So the United States is actually moderately low. There's other countries that are lower, but basically, we're not really comfortable with someone having a large amount of power, and we're used to questioning authority to a certain degree. So if your direct supervisor makes a bad call, we're fairly likely in the U.S. to try to basically call attention to it. Hey, I think this is a bad idea. Countries that have a very large amount of power distance are much more accepting that there are specific levels, and are much more accepting of the authority of those above them. They would be much less likely to question a decision even if they disagree. So again, looking at the countries, we find that Russia has a very high power difference, India has a fairly high power difference, France has a fairly high power difference, Denmark, the UK, and the US, less power difference. And this is again about the willingness of people in that culture to question authority. Uncertainty avoidance, the extent to which members of a culture feel comfortable in an unstructured situation. So some cultures really have a strong preference, and this is again not only in cultures as far as countries, but also organizations fall into these realms too. Some organizations are not comfortable with risk. They want to be very safe. They want very high structure. They want to know what's going to happen, and everyone has very structured roles. High uncertainty avoidance is basically places that are avoiding uncertainty. Low uncertainty avoidance is places that actually are okay with an unstructured situation and are okay with risk. So it's a tolerance for ambiguity and a tolerance for uncertainty. The U.S. is relatively moderately low in uncertainty avoidance, which means we're fairly okay with unstructured and risky situations. Japan and France do not like them. They are fairly high in uncertainty avoidance. And again, we see here a chart showing the various differences by country. Masculinity and femininity was another trait that Hofstede found, and this was more about the emotional roles that are presumptively distributed between men and women. So those cultures with a high masculine culture, the masculine role is very tough and the feminine role is very tender. So when you think of masculine versus femininity here, I would almost make an argument that masculine cultures are kind of traditional gender role cultures. So there's a strong adherence to the idea that there is a strong difference between men and women, and the roles of men and women are clearly defined and are different. Feminine cultures, I would actually say, are not necessarily feminine in that they're more of just non-traditional gender roles are more accepted. In other words, men and women aren't necessarily expected as strongly to fit into these roles. So it's a focus on interpersonal relationships and communication of the individual. So Sweden is moderately feminine, Japan is strongly masculine, US is moderate. And what that again means is that in Sweden, you don't see a strong reliance on gender roles in organizations. In Japan, you definitely find a very strong reliance on traditional gender roles in those organizations. And again, a chart kind of showing those differences. Sweden very low. The United States has been slowly reducing this factor, but there is still a strong differentiation, especially in the stereotypes and perceptions of men and women in the organizations in the United States. We also then have long-term versus short-term orientation. This is the extent to which people expect immediate versus delayed gratification. And again, this happens in organizations. Organizations can be long-term oriented, willing to take losses now to make profits in the future, or very short-term oriented, very much focused on profitability from month to month to month. China and Japan tend to have long-term orientations. The U.S., France, and Indonesia have short-term orientations. And also, the idea on an organizational level of long versus short-term orientation also has a little bit to do with how the economies are set up. So in the United States, basically most large organizations are also being traded publicly on the stock market. So there is an obligation to the stockholders to constantly be showing short-term profit, and that sometimes drives some bad decision making. And again, an examination of this. So long-term orientation. Notice Italy, Russia, France, Denmark very low. The United States and the U.S. and the U.K. fairly low. Japan and India fairly long. And most organizations, most countries we find, most organizations tend to be more short-term focused, and most cultures tend to be more short-term focused. So as I said, basically the purpose of this is just to kind of go through a theory and to kind of start getting the idea that part of IO psychology is not just measuring people and jobs, but also looking at that culture and that environment. So in the open systems model we talked about earlier in this set of lectures, I kind of talked about how inputs lead to throughputs, lead to outputs, but all of that occurs in an environment. And one of those environmental factors is the culture that that organization exists in. And Hofstede's theory is a theory that illustrates some of the kind of dimensions or traits that we want to consider when thinking about environments. So cultural issues in the workplace include how subordinates expect their leaders to lead. So the expectations of how leaders are to behave will be influenced by Hofstede's dimensions. What knowledge, skills, and abilities are considered important? So again, in an individualistic culture, probably individual skills are going to be highly valued. However, in a collectivistic culture, the ability to work in groups and to be a team player is going to be more highly valued. How compensation systems will be structured. So will an organization or a culture accept a 20-to-1 ratio versus a 400-to-1 ratio between the highest and lowest paid? And finally, how are decisions being made? Is it individual dictatorial, and is the culture okay with that, high power distance? Or does it need to be more consultative and collaborative, low power distance? So I hope this kind of gives you an idea of what IO psychology is, what it means to be an IO psychologist, a little bit of the history of IO psychology, and again, focusing on how the I and the O were developed, and the impact of the need for selection that drove IO psychology, the Hawthorne studies and the human resource kind of revolution that drove the O side, and finally, how that Civil Rights Act actually really drove the need for IO psychology to provide hard data in organizations that show that they're being unbiased in their selection and promotion. And finally, how culture impacts all of this.